Most people believe explaining themselves is a sign of honesty. They think clarity earns respect. They think justification proves innocence. But history and Machiavelli tells a different story. In the world of power, explanations are rarely interpreted as truth. They are interpreted as weakness. The moment you begin defending yourself, you silently accept that others have the authority to judge you. And the moment you try to justify your actions, you surrender the most valuable asset in strategy, perception control. Machiavelli understood something most people never learn. Powerful people do not spend their time explaining themselves. They act, they let results speak, and they allow mystery to do what explanations never can: command respect. In this audiobook, you will learn why explaining yourself weakens authority, how silence creates psychological dominance, how powerful figures maintain control without justification, and how mastering restraint can transform the way others perceive you. Because the truth is simple. The more you explain yourself, the smaller you appear. And the moment you stop explaining, people start paying attention. Chapter 1. Power speaks through actions, not explanations. There's a quiet rule that governs power. Most people never notice it, yet history obeys it relentlessly. Powerful individuals do not spend their time explaining themselves. They act, and once the action is taken, the world rearranges itself around the consequences. The average person believes authority comes from persuasion. They think strength lies in convincing others of their intentions, defending their choices, or clarifying their motives. But Machiavelli understood something far more uncomfortable. Authority is not granted through explanation. It is recognized through action. The moment someone begins explaining themselves too much, something subtle happens in the minds of observers. The explanation itself becomes evidence of doubt, and doubt, even when small, erodes a perception of power. Because human psychology operates on signals, not declarations. People do not judge strength based on what someone says about themselves. They judge it based on how decisively that person moves through the world. The illusion of justification. From childhood, people are trained to justify themselves. Teachers ask for explanations. Parents demand reasons. Society rewards those who defend their behavior politely. Over time, this conditioning creates a reflex. Whenever questioned, people immediately begin explaining. They explain why they made a decision. They explain what they meant. They explain what they were thinking. They explain what they did not intend. But what most fail to realize is that constant explanation subtly lowers perceived authority. Why? Because explanations shift the power dynamic. The moment you begin explaining your actions, you unconsciously accept that the other person has the right to judge you. You step into the position of the defendant, and the listener becomes the judge, even if that was never their intention. This is why powerful figures throughout history rarely feel the need to justify themselves to everyone around them, not because they are arrogant, but because they understand the psychological cost of over-explaining. Caesar and the Rubicon. History provides one of the clearest examples of this principle. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar faced a decision that would alter the fate of Rome. Roman law forbade generals from entering Italy with their armies. Doing so was considered an act of rebellion against the Republic. The Senate, fearing Caesar's rising influence, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar understood exactly what that meant. Without his army, he would be politically vulnerable. His enemies would prosecute him. His career would collapse, and perhaps his life would end. He stood on the banks of a small river called the Rubicon. On one side was obedience. On the other side was civil war. If Caesar crossed that river with his army, he would openly defy Rome. Now imagine how the average leader might respond to such a moment. They would send letters. They would attempt negotiations. They would explain their intentions. They would try to justify their position. They would attempt to convince Rome that their actions were reasonable. But Caesar did something very different. He crossed the river. No long speeches. No elaborate justification. No attempt to persuade the Senate. He acted, and by acting, he transformed the political reality of Rome. Once the army crossed the Rubicon, the debate was over. The action itself became the message. There was nothing left to argue. Rome now had to react to Caesar's decision, not judge it, not debate it, React to it. This is the essence of strategic authority. Decisive action changes the environment so completely that explanations become irrelevant. Why humans respect action? Human beings instinctively equate decisiveness with competence. When someone moves with certainty, others assume they understand something that is not immediately visible. But when someone hesitates and explains excessively, observers begin to detect uncertainty, even when the explanation is logical, even when the reasoning is valid. The human brain is not evaluating arguments the way philosophers do. It is evaluating signals of confidence. And confidence is demonstrated through action. Consider two individuals making the same decision. The first person says, "I chose this approach because after considering multiple possibilities, I felt it might be the best option given the circumstances." The second person simply says, "This is the direction we're going." Which one appears more certain? Which one appears more authoritative? Which one seems like they are comfortable carrying responsibility? The difference is not intelligence. The difference is certainty. And certainty rarely explains itself. The strategic power of silence after action. One of the most underestimated tactics in human interaction is silence after a decision has been made. Most people feel an immediate urge to explain their reasoning. They want to be understood. They want to be fair. They want to avoid criticism. But paradoxically, the more someone explains their reasoning, the more others begin to analyze it. And the more people analyze something, the more opportunities they find to question it. This is why powerful individuals often deliver decisions with minimal explanation, not because they lack reasoning, but because they understand something subtle. People interpret silence differently from speech. Silence after action forces others to draw their own conclusions. And human beings often interpret silence as confidence. They assume the person must have reasons too obvious to explain. They assume the individual must see something they themselves cannot yet see. Silence creates psychological gravity. Words often dissipate it. Results become the argument. The most powerful argument is not verbal. It is outcome. History rarely remembers the explanations behind decisions. It remembers the consequences. When a strategy succeeds, people retroactively assume it was intelligent. When it fails, they assume it was foolish. But during the moment of decision, nobody truly knows the future, which means that leadership often requires moving forward without the comfort of universal agreement. This is another reason explanations weaken authority. They attempt to win approval before results exist. But powerful individuals understand that approval is unreliable. Results are what matter. Instead of arguing about their decisions, they allow time to reveal the logic behind them. And once results appear, explanations become unnecessary. The outcome speaks. The trap of overtalking. There is another hidden danger in explaining too much. The more someone talks about their decisions, the more information they reveal. Intentions, uncertainties, possible weaknesses, strategic limitations. Every extra sentence exposes another layer of thought. This is why experienced negotiators often speak less than their counterparts. Silence invites the other person to keep talking, and the person who talks the most usually reveals the most. Powerful individuals understand that information is currency, and like any currency, it must be spent carefully. A quiet shift in perspective. At this point, a serious student strategy begins to recognize a pattern. Power is rarely loud. It is not constantly defending itself. It is not anxious to clarify every misunderstanding. Instead, it moves with quiet confidence. Actions first, words second, and sometimes no words at all. This does not mean reckless behavior. Decisive action still requires careful thinking. But once the decision has been made, endless explanation weakens the impact of the decision itself. The strategist acts, then watches how the world responds. The chapter takeaway. If there is one lesson to carry from this chapter, it is this. People trust visible action more than verbal justification. The more someone talks about their decisions, the less confident they appear. Powerful individuals allow their results to become their argument, and silence after action forces others to interpret events in your favor. But understanding this principle reveals another uncomfortable truth. When you explain yourself, you do more than reveal doubt. You also grant others something they did not previously possess, the authority to judge you. And that leads us to the next level of this rule of power. Because the moment you begin explaining yourself, you may have already surrendered the psychological advantage. In the next chapter, we explore a deeper Machiavellian truth. Explanations do not only weaken authority, they invite judgment. Chapter 2. Explanations invite judgment. There is a subtle moment that occurs in nearly every human interaction. Most people never notice it, but once you begin to see it, you cannot unsee it again. It is the moment when someone begins explaining themselves. The tone shifts, the dynamic changes, and almost instantly, a silent transformation takes place. The person speaking moves into the position of defendant, and the person listening moves into the position of judge. This shift is rarely intentional. No one explicitly declares, "I will now judge you," but human psychology operates through invisible hierarchies. The moment someone starts justifying their actions, explaining their motives, or defending their choices, they unintentionally hand the listener something powerful, the authority to evaluate them. And once that authority has been granted, it is very difficult to take it back. Machiavelli understood that power is not simply about force, wealth, or status. It is about control, perception. And perception is fragile. The smallest behavioral signals can reshape how others interpret your position in the hierarchy. Explaining yourself too much is one of those signals, because explanation implies accountability, and accountability, when offered too freely, invites judgment, the invisible courtroom. Most social interactions resemble a courtroom more than people realize. Someone speaks, another person evaluates, questions are asked, responses are analyzed. But here is the important detail. Courtrooms only exist when someone agrees to stand trial. If no one accepts the role of defendant, there is no case to judge. This is why powerful individuals are extremely careful about when they explain themselves and when they do not. They do not automatically accept every invitation to defend their decisions because they understand the psychological consequence. The moment you begin defending yourself, you acknowledge the other person's authority to question you, even if they never earned that authority. Imagine two different responses to criticism. In the first scenario, someone immediately begins explaining. Let me clarify why I did that. You see, the situation was complicated, and I had to consider several factors. The explanation may be perfectly reasonable, but something subtle has already happened. The listener now feels entitled to continue questioning. They may interrupt. They may challenge the reasoning. They may suggest alternatives. Why? Because the explanation itself created a space for judgment. Now imagine a different response. A calm, simple statement. That was a decision. No defense. No emotional justification. No attempt to persuade. Just certainty. Suddenly the dynamic feels different. The listener no longer feels like they are evaluating a case. They are confronting a decision that has already been made. And psychologically, people respond very differently to decisions than they do to explanations. Authority and boundaries. Power dynamics are reinforced through boundaries. The individuals who command the most respect are rarely the ones who constantly justify their behavior. They are the ones who demonstrate clear limits regarding what requires explanation and what does not. Consider the structure of leadership in any organization. A company executive does not explain every operational decision to every employee. A military commander does not justify each tactical move to every soldier. A judge does not debate every ruling with the courtroom. This does not mean these individuals lack reasoning. Quite the opposite. Their decisions are often based on extensive analysis, but they understand that authority requires distance. Too much explanation collapses at distance, and when distance disappears, hierarchy weakens. This is why leaders who over-explain often find themselves slowly losing control of their environment. Employees begin questioning decisions. Subordinates feel comfortable debating authority. Boundaries blur. Soon the leader is no longer leading. They are negotiating their legitimacy. And legitimacy that must constantly be negotiated is fragile. The paradox of transparency. Modern culture often praises transparency. People are encouraged to explain their intentions, clarify their reasoning, and reveal their thought processes. In certain contexts, this is valuable. Collaboration requires communication. Education requires explanation, but Machiavellian strategy focuses on a different dimension of human interaction, perception of authority. And in this dimension, excessive transparency can be dangerous, because the more someone explains their reasoning, the more opportunities others have to dissect it. Every explanation contains potential weaknesses. Every argument invites counterarguments. Every clarification creates new questions. Even brilliant reasoning can be challenged endlessly, but decisive action, delivered without endless justification, limits the space for debate. It shifts the focus from analysis to reality, and reality is much harder to argue with. Why people begin questioning you. There is another psychological effect that emerges when someone becomes accustomed to your explanations. They begin expecting them, and expectations create entitlement. Once people feel entitled to explanations, they begin asking for them more frequently. They question small decisions. They analyze minor choices. They interpret silence as avoidance. Over time, this pattern can create a culture of constant scrutiny. But the root cause often lies in the beginning. When someone explains themselves excessively, they establish a precedent. Others learn that questioning them produces detailed answers. So they continue questioning, not necessarily out of hostility, but because the behavior has been reinforced. This is why powerful individuals are careful about how they respond to early challenges. They understand that the first response sets the tone for future interactions. If the first response is defensive explanation, the relationship becomes evaluative. If the first response is calm certainty, the relationship becomes hierarchical, strategic silence. Silence is often misunderstood. Many people interpret silence as weakness, uncertainty, or avoidance. But in the hands of a strategist, silence becomes something very different. Silence can maintain hierarchy. When someone challenges you and you immediately begin explaining, you move closer to their level. But when you remain calm and controlled, offering minimal explanation, the dynamic changes. Your silence suggests confidence. Your restraint suggests certainty. It communicates that your decision does not require approval. And psychologically, this creates a powerful signal. People begin questioning themselves instead of questioning you. They wonder whether they misunderstood something. They reconsider their assumptions. Silence transfers a cognitive burden to the other person. And in social dynamics, whoever carries a cognitive burden often feels less powerful. The discipline of selective explanation. This principle does not mean never explaining anything. That would be impractical. Strategic individuals still communicate when necessary. They clarify when it serves a purpose. They explain when it strengthens alignment. But the key difference lies in selectivity. Explanations are offered strategically, not reflexively. They are used as tools, not as emotional reactions. When someone challenges a decision, the strategist does not feel an immediate urge to justify themselves. Instead, they pause, they observe, they ask themselves a simple question. Does this situation actually require explanation? Often the answer is no. The challenge may be insignificant. The critic may lack authority, or the decision may simply stand on its own. In those moments, silence becomes the wiser choice, because unnecessary explanations only create unnecessary judges. A subtle shift in power. Once you understand this dynamic, you begin noticing it everywhere. In meetings, in negotiations, in social circles. The person constantly explaining themselves often appears slightly defensive, even if they are intelligent, even if they are correct. Meanwhile, the individual who speaks calmly and sparingly often commands quiet respect. Their words carry more weight precisely because they use fewer of them. This is not coincidence. It is psychology. Humans associate brevity with certainty, and certainty with authority. The chapter takeaway. The moment you explain yourself too quickly, something invisible changes. You give others the power to evaluate you. Explaining yourself unintentionally lowers your status. People who feel entitled to your explanations often begin questioning you more frequently. And once that pattern begins, authority slowly erodes. Power dynamics are maintained through boundaries. And one of the strongest boundaries a strategist can maintain is strategic silence. But silence does more than protect authority. It creates something even more powerful. When people do not fully understand your reasoning, their minds begin searching for answers. They speculate, they interpret, they imagine possibilities. And often, those possibilities make you appear more capable than you actually revealed, which leads to the next level of this rule of power. Because in the world of strategy, uncertainty can be more powerful than clarity. And sometimes the greatest advantage you can cultivate is mystery. Chapter 3. Mystery is a form of psychological power. Power does not always reveal itself openly. In fact, some of the most influential figures in history understood a quiet truth that most people overlook. What people do not understand about you often becomes the source of your power. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. When we encounter something we cannot easily explain, our minds instinctively attempt to fill the gaps. We speculate, we interpret, we imagine hidden motives, deeper intelligence, or secret strategies. And often, those imagined qualities make the mysterious individual appear far more formidable than they might actually be. Machiavelli understood this psychological mechanism well. In political life, revealing too much about one's thinking was often dangerous. If rivals knew your intentions, they could predict your actions. If enemies understood your reasoning, they could prepare defenses. But when your motives remained unclear, others were forced into a state of constant uncertainty. And uncertainty produces caution. Caution produces hesitation. And hesitation, in the world of power, often determines who wins. Mystery, therefore, is not simply an aesthetic choice. It is a strategic tool. The power of the unknown. Imagine two leaders. The first leader explains every decision in detail. He describes his strategy, his reasoning, and his next steps. Everyone around him understands exactly what he plans to do. At first glance, this may seem like transparency and confidence, but there is a hidden cost. When people understand your strategy completely, they can begin planning around it. They can anticipate your moves. They can challenge your reasoning. And eventually, they may begin to believe they could lead just as well as you. Now imagine a second leader. This leader communicates less. He announces decisions, but rarely reveals every calculation behind them. His thinking remains partially hidden. His intentions are not always obvious. People observe him carefully, trying to understand his next move, but they cannot fully predict him. And because they cannot predict him, they treat him with greater caution. In many cases, they assume he sees possibilities they have not yet considered. His silence creates a subtle psychological effect. Others begin attributing intelligence and foresight to him, even in situations where they possess little evidence. This is the power of controlled mystery, not deception, not manipulation, but strategic restraint in revealing one's mind. Historical leaders who understood mystery. Throughout history, many powerful figures cultivated a deliberate aura of unpredictability. One well-known example is Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon rarely revealed his full strategy to anyone, including many of his own officers. Orders were often given only when necessary. Plans were concealed until the moment of execution. As a result, even his allies sometimes struggled to anticipate his intentions, but his enemies struggled even more. Rival commanders frequently found themselves reacting to Napoleon's movements rather than predicting them. His reputation grew partly because of this uncertainty. Opponents often assumed his plans were more complex than they actually were. They hesitated. They overanalyzed. They miscalculated. Napoleon understood that perception is often more powerful than reality, and mystery shapes perception. Another example comes from the world of politics. Many influential leaders intentionally limited how much of their personality or thoughts they revealed publicly. They spoke carefully. They avoided revealing their entire worldview. This created a sense of depth. Observers assumed there must be more beneath the surface. And in human psychology, perceived depth often becomes synonymous with intelligence. The psychological mechanism behind mystery. To understand why mystery creates power, we must look at how the human mind processes incomplete information. The brain dislikes uncertainty. When faced with missing pieces of information, it automatically begins constructing explanations. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as cognitive closure, the mind's desire to complete unfinished patterns. When someone reveals everything about themselves, there are no missing pieces. The mind stops searching. But when someone reveals only fragments, curiosity begins working. People begin analyzing their behavior. They replay conversations in their mind. They attempt to decode subtle signals. And during this process, something interesting happens. The observer often adds qualities that were never actually demonstrated. They assume hidden intelligence. They assume strategic thinking. They assume deeper motives. Mystery invites imagination, and imagination often amplifies perceived capability. This is why silent individuals in a room are sometimes perceived as more intelligent than those who speak constantly. The mind assumes a quiet person must be thinking deeply, whether or not that assumption is accurate. The danger of predictability. Predictability may feel comfortable, but in strategic environments, predictability reduces perceived power. When others know exactly how you will react in every situation, they begin adjusting their behavior accordingly. They may exploit your patterns. They may manipulate your expectations. They may feel confident confronting you because they know your likely response. Predictable leaders are easy to manage. Predictable opponents are easy to defeat. But unpredictable individuals create hesitation. When someone cannot easily predict your reaction, they proceed more carefully. They analyze your words more closely. They become cautious in challenging you. This does not mean behaving randomly or irrationally. True strategic unpredictability is controlled. It simply means avoiding the habit of revealing every thought and intention, because the more your mind becomes visible, the easier it becomes for others to navigate around you. Silence and projection. Another fascinating aspect of mystery is the way silence allows others to project their own assumptions onto you. When people do not fully understand someone, they often interpret that person to their own beliefs and expectations. If they respect intelligence, they may assume you are intelligent. If they respect discipline, they may assume you are disciplined. If they fear authority, they may assume you possess authority. This phenomenon explains why some individuals develop powerful reputations despite speaking very little. Their silence becomes a canvas, and observers paint their own interpretations onto that canvas. Sometimes those interpretations are exaggerated. Sometimes they are inaccurate, but they often enhance the perception of power, because the unknown always feels larger than the known, revealing less than you know. One of the quiet disciplines practiced by many strategic thinkers is controlled revelation. They know far more than they reveal. They observe carefully. They listen attentively. They gather information, but they speak selectively, not because they are secretive by nature, but because they understand that information is influence. Every time you reveal your full reasoning, you reduce the mystery surrounding your actions. Every time you describe your plans in detail, you make your behavior easier to anticipate. The strategist resists this impulse. Instead, they allow others to see the results of their thinking without always exposing the thinking itself. And this creates a perception of depth. Observers sense there is more beneath the surface, and often that perception alone strengthens authority. Mystery creates attention. There is another advantage to mystery. It captures attention. People rarely spend time analyzing individuals who reveal everything immediately. There is nothing left to discover. But when someone remains partially unreadable, curiosity grows. Others watch them more closely. They listen more carefully. They attempt to decode subtle signals. This increased attention can be strategically valuable because attention creates influence. When people study your behavior, your actions carry greater weight. Your decisions appear more deliberate. Your words feel more meaningful. All of this emerges not from speaking more, but from revealing less. The chapter takeaway. Mystery is not about deception. It is about restraint. The less people know about your reasoning, the more space their imagination has to interpret your intentions. Mystery forces others to think about you more. Predictability reduces perceived power. Silence encourages people to project authority onto you. And the most controlled public images always reveal less than they know. But mystery alone is not enough to sustain influence. There is another temptation that quietly undermines strategic individuals. It is a desire to be liked, the urge to seek approval, the instinct to explain yourself so others will understand and accept you. And that instinct leads many people to surrender their authority without realizing it. Because in the world of power, approval and authority rarely coexist comfortably, which brings us to the next chapter, a principle Machiavelli understood with brutal clarity. The powerful do not seek approval. Chapter 4. The powerful do not seek approval. There is a hidden motive behind many explanations. It is rarely spoken aloud. But if you observe human behavior carefully, you begin to notice it everywhere. Most explanations are not actually about clarity. They are about approval. When someone explains their decision repeatedly, what they often want is not simply understanding. They want reassurance. They want others to say, "That makes sense. You did the right thing. I agree with you." This desire is deeply human. From childhood, people are conditioned to seek acceptance from those around them. Approval signals belonging. Agreement signals safety. But the world of strategy operates under different rules. Because the moment your decisions depend on approval, your authority begins to weaken. And Machiavelli understood this with brutal clarity. A leader who needs approval cannot lead decisively. They become a negotiator of emotions rather than a director of outcomes. The hidden cost of approval. Imagine a leader making an important decision. Perhaps it affects a team, an organization, or a larger system. There will always be disagreement. This is inevitable. Different people see different risks. Different people prefer different strategies. But if the leader feels a deep need for everyone's approval, something predictable begins to happen. They start explaining more. They justify their reasoning repeatedly. They attempt to persuade every skeptic. They soften their decisions to avoid discomfort. And gradually, the clarity of the original decision begins to dissolve. What started as leadership becomes negotiation. And negotiation, when driven by emotional approval rather than strategic necessity, slowly erodes authority, because authority requires the ability to move forward without universal agreement. Machiavelli observed this dynamic repeatedly in political life. Leaders who try to satisfy everyone often satisfied no one. Their indecision frustrated allies and emboldened rivals. Meanwhile, leaders who acted decisively, even when controversial, often commanded greater respect, not because people always agreed with them, but because people sense independence. And independence is a signal of strength. Why humans seek approval. The desire for approval is rooted in deep psychological instincts. Human beings evolved in social groups where rejection could mean isolation. Isolation could mean danger. So our brains developed a powerful sensitivity to social acceptance. When others approve of our actions, the brain releases signals associated with reward. When others disapprove, the brain registers discomfort. This biological wiring makes approval-seeking behavior natural. But what is natural is not always strategic. In hierarchical environments, individuals who visibly depend on approval are often perceived as lower in status because dependence signals vulnerability. If someone needs constant reassurance, it implies their confidence is fragile, and fragile confidence rarely inspires authority. This is why the most respected figures often appear emotionally independent. They do not visibly depend on validation. They listen to opinions. They consider advice. But their final decisions are not emotionally negotiated. They are chosen. Strategists accept disagreement. Great strategists understand a difficult truth. Not everyone will agree with their decisions. And attempting to eliminate disagreement is often impossible. Consider military leadership. In times of war, decisions must often be made under uncertainty. Some advisors may support one strategy. Others may oppose it. If the commander attempts to win unanimous approval before acting, paralysis will follow. But if the commander listens carefully, evaluates information, and then decides, even in the presence of disagreement, authority is preserved. The key difference lies in emotional posture. The strategist does not panic when confronted with disagreement. They do not rush to explain themselves repeatedly. They accept that disagreement is a natural part of leadership, and they move forward. This calm acceptance sends a powerful psychological signal. It communicates confidence, and confidence often silences opposition more effectively than argument. Leaders who tolerate misunderstanding. One of the most difficult disciplines for a leader is tolerating misunderstanding. Most people feel uncomfortable when others misinterpret their intentions. They immediately want to correct the narrative. They clarify. They justify. They explain. But powerful individuals recognize something important. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Sometimes correcting a misunderstanding actually strengthens it by drawing more attention to it. Other times, explaining your reasoning to critics simply gives them more material to challenge. Strategic individuals therefore practice a form of restraint. They correct misinformation when it is strategically necessary. But they do not feel compelled to respond to every misinterpretation. They allow some misunderstandings to exist. Why? Because attempting to control every perception is impossible, and the attempt itself often appears defensive. Instead, powerful figures allow time and results to shape perception. Over time, outcomes speak more convincingly than explanations ever could. Emotional negotiation weakens authority. Approval seeking often reveals itself through emotional negotiation. A leader announces a decision. Someone challenges it. The leader immediately begins adjusting their explanation to maintain comfort in the room. They soften their language. They reassure critics repeatedly. They attempt to reduce tension. While this may feel polite, it creates a subtle psychological effect. Observers begin to sense that the decision is flexible. They sense that pressure might change it. And once that perception emerges, challenges increase. Because people naturally test boundaries when they believe those boundaries are negotiable. Strong leaders avoid this pattern. They listen carefully to objections. They consider useful information, but their decisions are not emotionally negotiated. They remain steady. This steadiness creates a psychological anchor. Others may disagree, but they recognize the presence of firm leadership, independence as a signal of confidence. Confidence is not declared. It is observed. One of the clearest signals of confidence is independence. An individual who acts according to their principles without constantly seeking validation appears internally stable. Their decisions appear deliberate. Their posture appears calm. People instinctively trust those who seem comfortable standing alone, not because independence guarantees correctness, but because it signals inner certainty. This is why some individuals command respect even when their decisions are controversial. Observers sense that the person is guided by internal conviction rather than external approval, and conviction, when genuine, has psychological weight. A quiet discipline. The discipline of avoiding approval seeking does not mean ignoring feedback. Strategic individuals still value information. They listen carefully. They gather perspectives, but they separate information from validation. Information helps refine decisions. Validation simply comforts the ego. When you remove the need for validation, decision-making becomes clearer. You evaluate options based on strategic value rather than social comfort, and this clarity strengthens authority, because others sense that your decisions are not driven by emotional pressure. They are driven by intention. The chapter takeaway. Explaining yourself often hides a deeper motive, the desire for approval. But approval-seeking behavior weakens leadership presence. Power grows when decisions are made without emotional negotiation. Strong leaders tolerate disagreement. They tolerate misunderstanding. And they demonstrate confidence through independence rather than persuasion. Because the moment your decisions depend on validation, your authority becomes fragile. Yet even those who overcome the need for approval face another strategic danger. Sometimes the greatest threat to power is not seeking approval. It is speaking too much. Because every unnecessary word reveals something about your thinking, your intentions, your uncertainties, your strategy. And in the world of power, information is rarely free, which leads us to the next principle Machiavelli understood deeply. The more you talk, the more you reveal. Chapter 5. The more you talk, the more you reveal. There's a quiet imbalance in most conversations. One person speaks, the other listens. But beneath the surface, something far more important is happening. Information is moving. Every sentence carries fragments of intention. Every explanation reveals priorities. Every story exposes personality. And every unnecessary word leaks something about the mind that produced it. In the world of strategy, information is not just communication. It is currency. And like any currency, it must be spent carefully. Most people spend it recklessly. They talk to fill silence. They talk to be liked. They talk to prove intelligence. They talk to avoid awkward pauses. But the strategist understands something different. Speech is exposure, and exposure reduces advantage. This is why many of the most powerful individuals in negotiations, politics, and leadership speak far less than the average person. They are not quiet because they lack ideas. They are quiet because they understand the value of information control. The asymmetry of conversation. Imagine two people sitting across from each other in a negotiation. The first person speaks frequently. They explain their position. They clarify their goals. They discuss their reasoning. They elaborate on possible outcomes. They share what they believe is fair. From their perspective, they are being transparent and persuasive. But from the perspective of the listener, something else is happening. With every sentence, new information appears. The listener learns what matters most to them. They learn which points make them uncomfortable. They learn which concessions they might be willing to make. And they learn how the other person thinks. Now imagine the second person. They speak occasionally, but sparingly. They ask questions. They pause. They listen carefully. They allow silence to exist. While the first person is trying to persuade, the second person is quietly gathering intelligence. And over time, the balance of knowledge becomes uneven. One side has revealed their thinking. The other side has revealed very little. In strategic environments, this imbalance often determines the outcome. The negotiator's silence. Professional negotiators understand this principle instinctively. In fact, many negotiation techniques rely heavily on silence. After making an offer, experienced negotiators often stop speaking entirely. They resist the urge to justify the offer. They avoid filling the silence with additional explanations. Why? Because silence creates psychological pressure. The other party begins thinking. They begin evaluating the offer. But silence also creates discomfort. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with conversational gaps. And when people feel that discomfort, they often try to relieve it by talking. They clarify their position. They reveal concerns. They suggest alternatives. They expose weaknesses in their own argument. Without realizing it, they begin negotiating against themselves. Meanwhile, the silent negotiator continues observing. Every new sentence becomes valuable information, and information in negotiation is power. Why humans fear silence? To understand why silence is so powerful, we must examine why it feels uncomfortable. Human conversation follows an unspoken rhythm. One person speaks, the other responds. The exchange continues smoothly. When that rhythm breaks, when silence appears unexpectedly, the brain interprets it as social tension. Something feels unresolved. Something feels incomplete. The mind begins searching for ways to restore equilibrium. Often, the easiest way to do this is simply to speak again. So people rush to fill the gap. They explain further. They repeat themselves. They add unnecessary detail. And in doing so, they reveal more than they intended. The strategist recognizes this pattern. And instead of fearing silence, they use it deliberately. The power of observation. One of the most valuable abilities in strategic thinking is observation. But observation requires attention, and attention requires quiet. When someone speaks constantly, they reduce their ability to observe. Their mind becomes occupied with producing words rather than analyzing behavior. But when someone speaks less, something interesting happens. They begin noticing patterns. They observe tone shifts. They detect hesitation in others. They recognize which topics generate discomfort. They see what others reveal unintentionally. All of this information becomes strategically useful because people often reveal their priorities not through what they say directly, but through how they react when speaking freely. Strategic listeners collect these signals quietly. They build a mental map of the situation, and by the time they speak again, they possess far more information than those around them. Excessive speech reveals strategy. Another hidden danger of excessive talking is that it exposes strategic thinking. When people explain their reasoning too openly, they reveal how they approach problems. They show their decision-making patterns. They expose their assumptions. And once others understand your mental patterns, they can anticipate your moves. Consider a chess match. If one player constantly described their entire strategy aloud, their opponent would gain a tremendous advantage. They would know which pieces matter most. They would know what the next move might be, and they could prepare counter strategies in advance. In real life, conversations often function in a similar way. The more someone reveals their internal logic, the easier it becomes for others to predict their actions. This is why experienced strategists rarely reveal their full reasoning in casual conversation. They speak enough to communicate decisions, but not enough to expose the entire architecture of their thinking. The discipline of controlled speech. Controlled speech is not silence for its own sake. It is deliberate communication. Strategic individuals still speak clearly when necessary. They articulate decisions. They deliver instructions. They share insights when appropriate, but they avoid unnecessary elaboration. They resist the impulse to explain every detail, and they remain comfortable with pauses in conversation. This discipline creates a subtle shift in perception. When someone speaks rarely but thoughtfully, their words carry greater weight. Listeners pay closer attention. Statements feel deliberate rather than impulsive. And over time, this controlled communication builds authority. Because people begin associating restraint with wisdom, silence reveals character. There is another benefit to speaking less. Silence reveals other people. When someone talks continuously, the conversation revolves around them. But when someone listens quietly, others often reveal their own character. They reveal impatience. They reveal insecurity. They reveal arrogance. Or sometimes, they reveal honesty and intelligence. These signals are invaluable because understanding people is one of the most important skills in strategic thinking. And the more someone speaks, the less they observe. The more someone listens, the more the world reveals itself. The illusion of intelligence through speech. Many people believe speaking more makes them appear more intelligent. They assume that offering constant commentary demonstrates knowledge. But the opposite is often true. When someone speaks excessively, listeners begin noticing inconsistencies. They detect uncertainty. They hear contradictions. And the perceived authority of the speaker begins to weaken. Meanwhile, the individual who speaks less often appears more thoughtful. Their silence suggests reflection. Their restraint suggests discipline. Even when both individuals possess equal intelligence, perception favors the quieter presence, because the mind interprets silence as deliberation. The chapter takeaway. Information is strategic currency, and every unnecessary word spend that currency. Silence encourages others to reveal themselves. Talking excessively exposes motives, priorities, and strategies. Strategic listeners gather power through observation, and controlled speech preserves advantage. The most effective communicators are not those who speak the most. They are those who speak with intention. But even when speech is controlled, another threat to authority remains. Sometimes the greatest danger is not speaking too much. It is reacting emotionally when challenged, because emotional reactions expose something even more revealing than information. They expose vulnerability. And in the world of power, vulnerability invites attack, which brings us to the next principle, one that separates strategic individuals from reactive ones. Emotional reactions destroy strategic image. Chapter 6. Emotional reactions destroy strategic image. Power is not only measured by what you do, it is also measured by how you react. Many individuals can make strong decisions. Many can speak confidently. Many can maintain authority when circumstances are calm. But the true test of strategic presence appears when pressure arrives, when criticism emerges, when someone challenges your decisions, when accusations appear. In these moments, the average person feels an overwhelming urge to defend themselves emotionally. They explain with intensity. They raise their voice. They justify their intentions. They attempt to prove that they are right. And in doing so, they unknowingly reveal something dangerous. They reveal that the criticism has reached them. It has disturbed their emotional balance. And once observers detect emotional disturbance, the perception of power begins to weaken. Machiavelli understood that authority is not only about controlling actions, it is about controlling appearance under pressure. Because in the eyes of observers, emotional stability signals strength. Emotional reactivity signals vulnerability. the moment authority begins to crack. Imagine a public figure facing criticism. A journalist asks a difficult question. An opponent challenges their decision. A rumor spreads questioning their motives. Now imagine two possible reactions. In the first scenario, the leader reacts emotionally. They interrupt the question. They defend themselves passionately. They attempt to dismantle the accusation point by point. Their voice grows sharper. Their explanation becomes longer, and the conversation becomes defensive. Even if their reasoning is correct, the emotional tone creates a powerful impression. Observers begin to wonder why the criticism affected them so strongly. They begin asking themselves a quiet question. If the accusation is false, why does the reaction seem so intense? In the second scenario, the leader responds differently. They remain calm. Their voice stays steady. They offer a brief response, perhaps a simple clarification, and then move on. They do not appear agitated. They do not attempt to dismantle every accusation. They do not behave as though the criticism has shaken them. And this composure sends a very different signal. Observers begin assuming that the criticism lacks significance, because if it mattered deeply, surely the leader would have reacted more strongly. This is a paradox of emotional defense. The more passionately someone defends themselves, the more attention they draw to the attack. The psychology of emotional defense. Human beings are highly sensitive to emotional cues. We constantly analyze tone, facial expressions, and body language. These signals often influence our judgments more than the actual content of words. When someone reacts defensively, our brains interpret that reaction as meaningful. The logic is simple. People usually react strongly when something matters. So when someone becomes emotionally defensive, observers assume the criticism must have struck a sensitive point, even if that assumption is incorrect, even if the accusation is completely false. The emotional reaction creates suspicion. This is why emotional explanations can unintentionally damage credibility. They amplify the perceived importance of the accusation. They signal that something worth defending has been touched. Meanwhile, calm responses produce the opposite effect. They suggest confidence. They suggest stability. They suggest that the criticism lacks power. And observers often follow the emotional signals they perceive. Why calmness disarms attacks? Calm indifference is one of the most powerful psychological responses to criticism, not because it suppresses emotion, but because it reframes the entire interaction. When someone attacks you verbally, they expect a reaction. They expect resistance. They expect argument. These reactions give the attacker energy. They create conflict. They generate attention. But when the response is calm, brief, and controlled, something unexpected happens. The conflict loses momentum. The attacker appears louder. The contrast between calm and aggression becomes visible, and observers begin reassessing the situation. Instead of focusing on the accusation, they begin focusing on behavior. Who appears composed? Who appears unstable? Often, the person who remains calm gains credibility automatically, not because they proved anything verbally, but because their behavior suggested confidence. The strategic advantage of emotional control. Emotional control is not simply about personal discipline. It is a strategic advantage. When you control your reactions, you control the frame of the situation. Consider two individuals facing criticism. The first reacts emotionally. They become defensive. They argue intensely. The conversation becomes chaotic. Now, the focus shifts from the original issue to the emotional conflict itself. Observers remember the tension. They remember the defensiveness. And often, they forget the actual facts. The second individual responds calmly. They acknowledge the criticism briefly. They maintain composure. They move forward. In this case, the criticism fades quickly because without emotional fuel, conflict struggles to sustain itself. The calm individual preserves their image, and the attacker loses momentum. This is why experienced leaders train themselves to remain composed under pressure, not because they lack emotions, but because they understand that emotional reactions broadcast signals they cannot control. The discipline of detachment. One of the most valuable habits a strategist can develop is emotional detachment. Detachment does not mean indifference to reality. It means refusing to allow external criticism to dictate internal reactions. When someone criticizes you, their words often trigger instinctive emotional responses. anger, frustration, the urge to defend. But the strategist pauses. They observe the reaction rather than immediately expressing it. They ask themselves a simple question. Does responding emotionally improve the situation? Most of the time, the answer is no. Emotional reactions rarely persuade critics. They rarely strengthen authority, and they rarely resolve the issue. Instead, they expose vulnerability. Detachment allows the strategist to maintain control over the narrative. They respond when necessary, but they do so with clarity rather than emotion. Composure as a signal of superiority. In social dynamics, composure often communicates superiority more effectively than argument. The calm individual appears confident. The emotional individual appears unsettled. Even when the emotional person is technically correct, their agitation weakens their image. Meanwhile, composure suggests inner stability. It suggests that the individual does not feel threatened, and people instinctively respect those who appear unthreatened. This is why many influential figures develop an almost deliberate slowness in their reactions. They pause before responding. They maintain a measured tone. They refuse to match the emotional intensity of their critics. This calmness becomes part of their reputation, and reputation shapes perception long before words are analyzed. The strategic response to criticism. A strategist does not ignore criticism entirely. Some criticism contains valuable information. Some accusations require correction, but the response is controlled, measured, selective. Instead of reacting immediately, the strategist evaluates the situation. Is the criticism credible? Does it require a response? Will responding increase or decrease its visibility? Only after answering these questions do they act. This calculated approach prevents unnecessary emotional displays, and it ensures that responses strengthen authority rather than weaken it. The chapter takeaway. Emotional reactions reveal more than words. Explaining yourself emotionally signals that criticism has destabilized you. Emotional explanations amplify perceived weakness. Calm indifference neutralizes attacks. Power is associated with emotional control, and composure communicates superiority more effectively than argument. The strategist understands that reactions shape perception as much as actions. But emotional reactions are not the only trap people fall into when defending themselves. Sometimes a mistake is even simpler. Sometimes people cannot tolerate being misunderstood. They feel an immediate urge to correct every misinterpretation, every rumor, every false assumption. Yet paradoxically, constantly correcting misunderstandings can weaken power rather than strengthen it, because in the world of perception, some misunderstandings are not threats. They are advantages, which brings us to the next principle, a discipline that requires remarkable restraint. Let people misunderstand you. Chapter 7. Let people misunderstand you. One of the strongest impulses in human behavior is the desire to be understood. When someone misinterprets our intentions, we feel an immediate urge to correct them. When someone spreads an inaccurate version of our actions, we rush to clarify. When rumors appear, we feel compelled to defend the truth. This impulse feels natural. It feels fair, and it feels necessary. But the strategist sees something that most people do not. Not every misunderstanding is a problem. In fact, some misunderstandings quietly strengthen power. Machiavelli understood that reputation is rarely built on perfect clarity. It is built on perception. And perception is shaped not only by facts, but by imagination. The moment you attempt to correct every interpretation, every rumor, and every assumption, you reveal something unexpected. You reveal insecurity. Because the person who desperately needs to control every narrative appears uncertain about their own authority. Meanwhile, the individual who allows some ambiguity to exist appears confident enough not to care, and that confidence becomes part of their image. The illusion of narrative control. Modern culture often encourages people to control their narrative. We are told to manage our image carefully, clarify misunderstandings quickly, respond to rumors immediately, explain ourselves thoroughly. But the reality of human perception is far more complicated. Narratives are rarely controlled by a single individual. They evolve through conversation, interpretation, and social storytelling. Even when someone explains their position perfectly, others will still reinterpret through their own beliefs. Some will misunderstand intentionally. Others will misunderstand unconsciously. Trying to eliminate all misunderstanding is therefore impossible. And when someone constantly attempts to do so, it creates an unintended signal. They appear anxious about how others perceive them. This anxiety weakens authority, because people instinctively respect individuals who seem comfortable with uncertainty. The power of strategic ambiguity. Strategic individuals understand the value of ambiguity. Ambiguity leaves room for interpretation, and interpretation activates imagination. When people are uncertain about someone's full intentions or capabilities, they often assume depth. They assume hidden strategy. They assume complexity. This is why some of the most influential figures in history allowed multiple interpretations of their actions to exist simultaneously. They did not rush to clarify every rumor. They did not attempt to correct every misunderstanding. Instead, they allowed ambiguity to circulate, and often that ambiguity strengthened their reputation. Observers began projecting their own theories onto them. Some assumed brilliance, others assumed cunning, but almost everyone assumed something significant must be happening beneath the surface, and that assumption alone increased their perceived power. Leaders and the creation of myth. History shows that many influential leaders developed reputations that were larger than reality, not because they constantly promoted themselves, but because they allowed mystery to grow around them. Rumors circulated, stories evolved, interpretations multiplied, and instead of correcting every exaggeration, these leaders remained silent. Over time, their image became something almost mythical. Opponents feared them, followers admired them. Observers speculated endlessly. The truth of their actual intentions mattered less than the perception surrounding them. Machiavelli understood this dynamic clearly. He observed that rulers often benefited from appearing more formidable than they truly were. And one of the easiest ways to cultivate this perception was simply not correcting every interpretation. Because once people begin telling stories about you, those stories often become more powerful than explanations. The insecurity of constant correction. Now imagine the opposite behavior. An individual who constantly corrects every misunderstanding. Someone spreads a rumor. They immediately respond. Someone misinterprets a statement. They rush to clarify. Someone questions their motives. They write long explanations defending themselves. At first glance, this behavior may seem responsible, but psychologically, it communicates something very different. It signals sensitivity. It signals vulnerability. And most importantly, it signals that perception has power over them. Observers begin realizing something important. They realize that by questioning or criticizing this person, they can provoke a reaction. Once that pattern becomes visible, challenges increase. Critics become louder. Rumors spread faster, because people are naturally drawn to reactions. But when someone refuses to react to every interpretation, the dynamic changes. Without reactions, many rumors lose energy. Speculation fades, and the individual retains control over their composure. Reputation is built through observation. Another reason strategic individuals tolerate misunderstanding is that reputation ultimately forms through observation. People watch behavior over time. They notice patterns. They evaluate results. And gradually, they construct an image of the person they are observing. This process rarely depends on a single explanation. It depends on consistency. If someone's actions repeatedly demonstrate competence, integrity, or strength, observers eventually recognize those qualities, even if rumors exist, even if misunderstandings circulate. But if someone constantly attempts to explain their character, the effect is often weaker, because reputation is not built through declarations. It is built through repeated evidence. And evidence speaks far louder than explanations. Selective silence. The key discipline here is selective silence. Strategic individuals do not ignore every misunderstanding. Some situations genuinely require clarification. False accusations may damage important relationships. Critical misinformation may need correction, but the strategist evaluates each situation carefully. They ask themselves, does correcting this misunderstanding actually strengthen my position, or does responding simply give it more attention? Often, silence is the wiser option. because silence denies the misunderstanding the energy it needs to grow. And silence also reinforces a perception of confidence. The individual appears unaffected, unbothered, stable. This calm posture becomes part of their image, and image shapes influence. The intrigue of the unexplained. Another fascinating effect of selective silence is intrigue. When people cannot fully understand someone, curiosity increases. They observe more closely. They listen more carefully. They analyze subtle behaviors. In many cases, this attention increases the perceived importance of the individual. Their actions appear deliberate. Their silence appears thoughtful. Their presence carries weight. All of this emerges not from explaining more, but from revealing less. Mystery and misunderstanding often create fascination, and fascination is a powerful form of influence. The discipline of letting go. Letting people misunderstand you requires emotional discipline. It means resisting the urge to defend yourself instantly. It means accepting that some people will form inaccurate opinions. It means trusting that your actions, over time, will speak more clearly than explanations. This discipline can feel uncomfortable at first, because the instinct to correct misunderstandings is strong. But with practice, something interesting happens. You begin noticing how many misunderstandings resolve themselves naturally. Rumors fade. Speculation disappears. And the people who truly matter often judge you based on experience rather than hearsay. Meanwhile, your calm refusal to react strengthens your reputation. You appear composed, confident, unbothered, and those qualities quietly command respect. The chapter takeaway. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Correct only what strategically matters. Misinterpretations can strengthen mystique. Reputation is shaped more by perception than explanation, and selective silence builds intrigue. The strategist understands that attempting to control every narrative is impossible, but silence allows perception to develop in powerful ways. Yet silence has another strategic advantage beyond protecting reputation. When used carefully, silence can shift pressure onto others. It can make them reveal their intentions, their priorities, and their weaknesses, because when one person remains quiet, the other often begins speaking, which leads us to the next principle of psychological strategy, a technique used by negotiators, interrogators, and master observers alike. Silence forces others to reveal their position. Chapter 8. Silence forces others to reveal their position. Most people think influence comes from speaking well, from persuasive arguments, from clever words, from the ability to explain ideas convincingly. But those who study power closely eventually discover a deeper truth. Control in conversation rarely belongs to the person who speaks the most. It belongs to the person who controls the pace of the interaction. And nothing controls pace more effectively than silence. Silence is often misunderstood. To the untrained mind, silence feels like absence, like hesitation, like uncertainty. But in the hands of a strategist, silence becomes something entirely different. It becomes pressure. It becomes observation. And most importantly, it becomes a tool that causes other people to reveal far more than they intended. Because human beings are uncomfortable with quiet. And when discomfort appears, people instinctively try to eliminate it, usually by speaking. The hidden pressure of silence. Imagine a conversation between two individuals negotiating a decision. One person makes a proposal. Then they stop talking. They simply wait. At first, the silence feels neutral. But after a few seconds, something begins happening inside the other person's mind. Questions emerge. Should I respond? Are they waiting for me to say something? Did I misunderstand their position? Why aren't they explaining further? As the silence continues, the discomfort grows. Most people are not trained to tolerate this tension, so they attempt to relieve it. They begin speaking. They clarify their concerns. They explain their position. They reveal what they want. And sometimes, without realizing it, they begin negotiating against themselves. All because one person remained quiet. This is the psychological leverage created by silence. It shifts the burden of communication onto the other party. And whoever carries that burden usually reveals more information. The negotiators pause. Experienced negotiators use silence deliberately. After presenting an offer, they pause. They resist the urge to explain the offer further. They do not rush to defend it. They do not immediately soften the terms. They simply wait. To an inexperienced negotiator, this pause can feel unbearable. They assume the silence means the offer was weak. They begin talking again. They justify the offer. They explain why it is fair. They may even begin offering concessions before the other party has asked for any. But the experienced negotiator understands something important. The first person who breaks the silence often loses leverage, because the act of filling the silence usually reveals urgency, and urgency weakens negotiating power. The patient negotiator watches carefully. They observe body language. They listen to the first response. And from that response, they gain insight into what truly matters to the other side. All of this information arrives simply because one person was willing to remain quiet. Silence reveals priority. One of the most valuable pieces of information in any negotiation or conversation is priority. What does the other person truly care about? What are they willing to compromise? What are they unwilling to lose? These priorities are rarely stated clearly at the beginning, but silence often brings them to the surface. When someone begins speaking to fill silence, they tend to reveal the issues that concern them most. They repeat certain points. They emphasize particular fears. They mention certain outcomes repeatedly. These patterns expose what matters most to them. And once you understand someone's priorities, you gain enormous strategic clarity. Because negotiation becomes much easier when you know exactly what the other side values. Silence helps uncover that information naturally, without confrontation, without interrogation, without pressure. The person who controls pace. In any conversation, someone controls the tempo. Either the conversation moves quickly, filled with rapid responses and constant explanations, or it moves slowly, with pauses and measured statements. The individual who controls the tempo often controls the direction. People who speak quickly and continuously often feel driven by urgency. They rush to explain. They rush to clarify. They rush to persuade. Meanwhile, the quiet individual slows the entire exchange. They speak briefly. They pause. They observe. Their calm pacing creates psychological stability. Others begin adapting to their rhythm. This is why the quiet person in a room often appears more authoritative. Their measured pace suggests control. Their restraint suggests confidence. And people instinctively follow the rhythm set by the calmest individual present. Observation before reaction. Silence also creates space for observation. When someone speaks constantly, they become absorbed in their own thinking. They focus on constructing arguments. They focus on responding quickly. But when someone pauses before speaking, they gain time to analyze. They notice subtle reactions. They detect hesitation in others. They observe emotional shifts. These small details often reveal more than words. For example, a slight pause before answering a question may reveal uncertainty. A defensive tone may reveal discomfort. A sudden change in posture may reveal tension. These signals provide valuable insight into the situation, but they are easy to miss when conversation moves too quickly. Silence slows the interaction enough for observation to occur, and observation strengthens strategy. Information flows toward the patient. There's an old principle in strategy. Information flows toward the patient mind. The individual who rushes to speak reveals information. The individual who waits receives it. This principle applies not only in negotiations, but in everyday social dynamics. Consider a meeting where one person immediately offers opinions on every topic. They reveal their preferences quickly. They reveal their assumptions. They reveal their priorities. Meanwhile, another person listens quietly. They allow others to speak first. They watch how different people respond. By the time they speak, they already understand perspectives of everyone in the room. Their contribution appears more informed, more strategic, more deliberate, all because they gathered information before revealing their own position. This is the advantage of patience. Silence as psychological confidence. Many people fear silence because they interpret it as weakness. They assume they must constantly speak to maintain presence. But experienced strategists understand the opposite. Silence often communicates confidence. The person who speaks calmly and pauses comfortably appears secure. They do not seem desperate to persuade. They do not seem anxious to justify themselves. Their restraint suggests inner stability, and people instinctively trust individuals who appear comfortable with silence. This is why powerful figures often pause before answering questions. They take a moment. They reflect. They respond slowly. These pauses communicate thoughtfulness. They suggest that the individual is considering the situation carefully, and this perception strengthens authority. The strategic use of questions. Silence becomes even more powerful when combined with simple questions. A strategist may ask a brief question, then remain silent. The other person begins answering, but because silence follows the answer, they continue speaking. They elaborate. They clarify. They reveal additional details. Each sentence provides new information, and the strategist gathers it all without revealing much about their own thinking. This technique is used in negotiations, intelligence work, and leadership because it encourages the other person to reveal their position voluntarily, not through pressure, but through conversation. The chapter takeaway. Silence shifts psychological pressure onto the other person. Silence is a powerful negotiation tool. The quiet individual often controls the pace of conversation. Observing before speaking increases strategic clarity, and information naturally flows toward the patient mind. But even when silence reveals information, there remains another factor that protects power more effectively than any explanation: reputation. Because when reputation is strong, explanations become unnecessary. People assume competence. They assume intention. They assume authority. And the silent individual rarely needs to defend themselves at all, which leads us to the next principle, one that quietly protects the powerful from constant scrutiny. Reputation protects the silent. Chapter 9. Reputation protects the silent. There comes a point in the development of authority when something interesting happens. Explanations become unnecessary, not because criticism disappears, not because misunderstandings stop occurring, but because reputation begins doing the work that words once had to do. When a person's reputation becomes strong enough, people no longer analyze every decision individually. Instead, they interpret new actions through the lens of past behavior. And this psychological shortcut changes everything. Because once reputation forms, perception becomes self-reinforcing. Machiavelli understood this clearly. A ruler who had already established a reputation for competence and strength rarely needed to defend every decision. Observers assumed there must be a reason. Supporters trusted the pattern. Even critics hesitated before challenging openly. Reputation becomes a shield, and the more powerful that reputation becomes, the less often explanations are required. The psychological shortcut. Human beings process enormous amounts of information every day. Because of this, the brain relies on shortcuts to make judgments quickly. One of the most powerful shortcuts is reputation. When we hear a respected surgeon propose a treatment, we assume competence. When we hear an experienced strategist suggest a plan, we assume there is logic behind it, not because we personally verified every detail, but because their reputation has already created credibility. The same mechanism operates in leadership and influence. When someone consistently demonstrates competence, observers begin forming expectations. They expect intelligence. They expect discipline. They expect thoughtful decisions. So when a new action occurs, people interpret within that framework. They assume there must be reasoning behind it. And because of this assumption, the leader rarely needs to explain themselves in detail. Their history speaks first. Reputation as strategic capital. Just like information, reputation is a form of capital. It accumulates slowly, and once accumulated, it becomes incredibly valuable. But unlike money, reputation cannot be purchased instantly. It must be built through consistent behavior over time. Every decision contributes to it. Every action adds evidence. Every interaction strengthens or weakens the image others form. When actions consistently demonstrate competence, observers gradually build trust. They begin expecting thoughtful decisions. And once that expectation becomes stable, something remarkable occurs. People start defending you before you defend yourself. Colleagues speak in your favor. Observers assume criticism must be exaggerated. Allies interpret your silence as confidence. In other words, your reputation begins protecting you. Why powerful leaders rarely defend themselves. If you study influential leaders, you will notice a pattern. They rarely rush to defend themselves after every criticism, not because they ignore challenges, but because they understand protection their reputation provides. When a respected leader faces criticism, many observers instinctively ask, is this accusation consistent with what we know about them? If the answer is no, the criticism often loses credibility quickly. But if a leader has no established reputation, the situation looks very different. Without a history of consistent behavior, observers have little evidence to rely on, so accusations carry greater weight, rumors spread more easily, and explanations become necessary simply to maintain credibility. This is why building reputation early is so important, because once reputation exists, silence becomes safer. Without it, silence can be misinterpreted. The damage of over-explaining. Ironically, the very behavior people use to defend their reputation can weaken it. When someone constantly explains themselves, something subtle happens. Observers begin questioning their confidence. They begin wondering why the individual feels a need to justify every action. Even if the explanations are reasonable, the frequency of explanation creates doubt, because people instinctively expect confident individuals to remain composed. When someone appears overly defensive, it disrupts the image of authority. It suggests insecurity. And insecurity weakens the psychological protection reputation provides. This is why powerful figures often respond to criticism briefly, or sometimes not at all. They rely on the accumulated evidence of their past behavior. And most of the time, that evidence speaks louder than explanations. Consistency creates authority. Reputation is not built through dramatic moments. It is built through consistency. Small actions repeated over time shape perception more effectively than grand declarations. When someone consistently demonstrates discipline, observers begin associating them with reliability. When someone consistently makes thoughtful decisions, observers associate them with intelligence. And once these associations become stable, reputation solidifies. From that point forward, new actions are interpreted through the existing reputation. Even mistakes may be interpreted generously. Observers may assume there was a hidden reason, or that the mistake is an exception rather than a pattern. This is the protective power of reputation. It changes how people interpret behavior. Quiet confidence. One of the most recognizable signals of strong reputation is quiet confidence. Individuals with established credibility rarely feel the need to announce their competence. They do not constantly prove themselves. They do not rush to defend their decisions. Instead, they carry themselves with calm certainty. Their posture communicates stability. Their responses remain measured, and their silence often speaks louder than arguments. This quiet confidence reinforces their status. Observers see consistency between reputation and behavior, and that consistency strengthens trust. Over time, people begin interpreting their silence not as avoidance, but as assurance. The absence of explanation becomes a signal of confidence. Reputation and time. Another important aspect of reputation is time. Reputation does not form overnight. It emerges gradually through repeated observation. But once it exists, it influences perception continuously. Every new action is filtered to the memory of previous ones. This is why experienced leaders often focus less on defending individual moments and more on maintaining long-term consistency. They understand that reputation is a long game. A single criticism rarely destroys it, but repeated inconsistency eventually will. So instead of reacting emotionally to every challenge, they protect the larger pattern. They continue acting in alignment with the image they have built, and over time, that consistency preserves their authority. The strategic patience of reputation. For the strategist, reputation offers something extremely valuable. Patience. When reputation is strong, there is no urgency to explain every decision immediately. There is time for results to emerge, time for observers to evaluate outcomes, time for criticism to lose momentum. This patience allows the strategist to maintain composure. They do not rush to defend themselves. They allow the long-term pattern of their actions to speak. And often, that pattern proves more persuasive than any explanation ever could. The chapter takeaway. When reputation is strong, explanations become unnecessary. People rely on reputation as a shortcut for judging credibility. Build that reputation through consistent actions. A strong reputation eventually defends itself. Over-explaining damages perceived authority, and quiet confidence reinforces status. The strategist understands that reputation is the invisible shield protecting silence. But reputation alone does not create mastery. The final stage of strategic thinking requires something deeper. It requires distance, the ability to observe human behavior without becoming emotionally entangled in it. Because the greatest strategists do not simply participate in social dynamics. They step outside them. They watch carefully. They analyze patterns others miss. And from that position of detachment, they gain a profound advantage, which brings us to the final principle, the discipline that separates ordinary thinkers from true observers of power. Become the observer, not the participant. Chapter 10, the final discipline, become the observer. At the highest level of strategic thinking, something fundamental changes. You stop reacting. You start observing. Most people move through life as participants in every emotional current around them. Someone criticizes them, they react. Someone misunderstands them, they explain. Someone challenges them, they defend. Their behavior becomes a continuous series of emotional responses to external stimuli. They are not directing the situation. They are being directed by it. But the strategist eventually reaches a different stage of awareness, a stage where emotional participation begins to fade, and something else replaces it. Observation. This is the final discipline of power, the ability to step slightly outside the emotional chaos of social interaction and watch it unfold with clarity. Because once you stop reacting impulsively, you begin seeing patterns others miss. The difference between participants and observers. In every social environment, there are two types of individuals, participants and observers. Participants are emotionally involved in every moment. They respond instantly. They defend themselves when challenged. They compete for attention. They argue. They try to win approval. And because they are constantly reacting, their perspective becomes narrow. They see only the immediate situation. They see only the person in front of them. They see only the emotional tension of the moment. Observers operate differently. They still participate in life. But internally, they maintain distance. When conflict appears, they notice the emotional reactions of others. When someone criticizes them, they observe the motivation behind the criticism. When someone praises them, they examine the intention behind the praise. Instead of immediately reacting, they study the situation. They watch behavior unfold. And this quiet observation reveals something remarkable. Human behavior follows patterns, predictable patterns. But those patterns are invisible to people who are emotionally entangled in the moment. The strategic advantage of detachment. Detachment is often misunderstood. Some people interpret it as coldness. Others interpret it as indifference. But strategic detachment is neither of those things. It is simply clarity without emotional interference. When emotions dominate perception, judgment becomes distorted. Anger exaggerates threats. Fear amplifies uncertainty. Desire clouds reasoning. But when someone maintains emotional distance, they gain access to clearer perception. They notice subtle cues. They recognize manipulation. They detect patterns in behavior. And once patterns become visible, prediction becomes possible. This is the essence of strategic thinking. Seeing what others cannot see because they are too emotionally involved. Master strategists as observers. History consistently shows that the most effective strategists possessed remarkable observational discipline. They watched people carefully. They listened more than they spoke. They allowed situations to unfold before responding. This gave them an enormous advantage. While others reacted impulsively, the strategists collected information. While others revealed their intentions, the strategists observed them quietly. Over time, the strategists built a mental map of personalities, motivations, and alliances. This map allowed them to anticipate behavior. And anticipation is one of the most powerful forms of control. Because when you can predict how people will react, you can shape the environment before they even realize it. Emotional distance reveals truth. Another advantage of detachment is the ability to see motivations clearly. When someone is emotionally involved in a situation, they often interpret events through personal bias. Criticism feels like hostility. Disagreement feels like betrayal. Silence feels like rejection. But the observer sees something different. They ask questions instead of reacting. Why did that person say this? What are they trying to gain? What pressure are they experiencing? What pattern does this behavior fit? These questions transform emotional reactions into analysis. And analysis reveals truth more reliably than emotion. Often, what appears to be personal hostility is actually insecurity. What appears to be disrespect is actually fear. What appears to be confidence is sometimes disguise. Observers recognize these patterns because they step back far enough to see them. Silence is a tool for understanding. Silence plays a crucial role in this final discipline. When you speak constantly, you become absorbed in expressing your own thoughts. But when you remain quiet, the world begins revealing itself. People speak freely. They expose their concerns. They reveal their priorities. They demonstrate their character through behavior rather than words. The silent observer gathers this information effortlessly. And over time, this information becomes an extraordinary advantage because understanding people is the foundation of influence. If you understand someone's fears, you understand their decisions. If you understand someone's ambitions, you understand their actions. And silence allows you to learn these things naturally. Recognizing patterns. The observer begins noticing patterns that others overlook. Certain individuals seek validation constantly. Others pursue dominance in every conversation. Some react emotionally to small provocations. Others remain composed under pressure. These patterns rarely change quickly. They repeat themselves across different situations. And once you recognize them, predicting behavior becomes easier. The strategists begin seeing not just individual moments, but entire behavioral systems. This awareness transforms social interaction. Instead of reacting to surprises, the strategist anticipates them. Instead of defending themselves constantly, they position themselves advantageously before conflict even begins. All of this becomes possible because they learn to observe rather than react, studying people instead of fighting them. One of the most powerful shifts in perspective occurs when the strategist stops viewing every interaction as a battle. Instead, they begin viewing it as study. Every conversation becomes a source of information. Every reaction reveals personality. Every disagreement exposes priorities. Rather than try to defeat others immediately, the strategist focuses on understanding them. And understanding creates influence. Because once you understand someone's motivations, you know how to interact with them effectively. Some people respond to respect. Others respond to authority. Others respond to incentives. Observers identify these patterns naturally, and this knowledge makes social environments far easier to navigate. The quiet confidence of the observer. Perhaps the most noticeable quality of an observer is calmness. Because they are not emotionally entangled in every situation, they rarely feel overwhelmed. They do not rush to defend themselves. They do not panic when criticized. They do not chase approval. Instead, they remain composed, watching, learning, adjusting quietly. This calm presence often gives them an aura of quiet authority. Others sense that they are thinking deeply, that they are analyzing the situation. And this perception alone can influence how people behave around them, because humans instinctively respect those who appear perceptive. The final discipline, becoming an observer, is not something that happens instantly. It requires practice. It requires resisting the urge to react immediately. It requires tolerating silence. And it requires patience. But over time, the rewards become obvious. Situations that once felt chaotic begin revealing structure. People who once seemed unpredictable begin displaying recognizable patterns. And social dynamics that once felt confusing begin making sense. The strategist gains clarity. And clarity is the foundation of power. The chapter takeaway. The highest form of strategic power is detachment. Observers recognize patterns others miss. Emotional distance increases strategic awareness. Silence allows deeper understanding of social dynamics. And the strategist studies people instead of reacting to them. Those who master observation gain something rare. They see the game being played while others are still trapped inside it. Final reflection. Most people spend their lives explaining themselves. They justify their choices. They defend their intentions. They seek approval from audiences that hold no real authority. But the student of Machiavelli understands a different rule. Power is not proven through explanation. It is demonstrated through presence, action, and restraint. When you stop explaining, people begin interpreting. When you stop defending, people begin respecting. And when your actions consistently produce results, your silence becomes your strongest argument. The greatest strategists in history understood this simple discipline. Speak less, observe more, act decisively, and remember the quiet rule of power. Those who truly command authority rarely feel the need to explain it. If you value learning the deeper psychology of power, strategy, and human behavior, consider subscribing to this channel, where each audiobook explores the timeless principles that shape influence, perception, and control.